Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on another live chat here on YouTube. I am your host, Jensen Beeler of Asphalt Rubber, and today I am very lucky to have with me custom motorcycle builder Walt Siegl. Walt, thank you so much for joining us today and for talking with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I was telling you before the show, I'm really glad that we got this opportunity to chat. I've been kind of trying to track you down for a while now, and the stars seem to align. But if I can just stroke your ego a little bit, I'm a big fan. I really love the bikes that you're building right now. I think you're one of the top designers in the space, and yeah, I'm really excited to kind of pick your brain and see how you see the world, because obviously you're creating some amazing things.
No, I appreciate it.
Let's just start with how you got into this. Tell me about Walt. What's your background? What's your story? Because I heard a little bit about you, and you sound like a pretty interesting guy.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I got into motorcycles through family connections. Both my grandfathers had bikes. My dad had previously a motorcycle, so they were in my life from early on. Both my grandfathers appreciated the looks and the design of motorcycles more than using them to go from A and B. And I think this is where my love for motorcycle looks played a big role. Both my grandfathers were big heroes of mine. There were a lot of conversations about design and performance on kitchen tables. So from early on, they really were an important factor in my upbringing. And this is how it all really started.
Were your parents motorcyclists as well, or is it just the generation before?
My dad had a motorcycle, but he was I was somewhat of a daredevil on scooters and bicycles. And once I started pushing for a dirt bike when I was 12, he was extremely concerned that he's losing me. So it was a battle for a while until I was a teenager, and I guess all teenagers have the tendency to fight authority, and so of course I ignored my dad's worries and ended up with a dirt bike, and this is how I really then started on performance motorcycles, if you will. That interest in performance bikes then never really left me. Yes, I was interested in riding all different kind of motorcycles, but performance bikes really is what I was after, and that's how I then picked up racing as an 18-year-old, and so on and so forth.
Tell me about how you got into doing design and building your own bikes. What is your background in aesthetics? Is your background in machining? Where did this come from?
Well, I pushed hard to have my parents allow me to go to art school. Throughout my childhood, I was interested in architecture and art per se. Convinced them to let me go to art school, pushed hard through art school, but had motorcycles during that time, which was seen by a lot of my friends as a conflict. They don't necessarily agreed at that time that a motorcyclist could have creative interests. So it was quite interesting. And so I went to art school and then left art school as an 18-year-old, a few months before graduation, to just push on. I think all young people are trying to travel and explore, and so I left the country. I moved to Marseille in France and worked as a shunter to make a living. picked up racing in the hills around Marseille, so-called time trials, and didn't have enough money to really finance my racing. So I tried to figure out how to learn how to weld, how to build things, and that brought me then into an opportunity to have an apprenticeship with a machinist in Germany. I moved to Germany and did an apprenticeship, and now I'm a tool maker. And so I learned all the machining, I learned the trade, and the connections in Germany then brought me to job opportunities in Italy. I worked as a welder for a while. And through all my travels, I ended up then, through connections, I ended up in foreign service. Left Italy, moved to Austria briefly, then moved through the foreign service to Moscow, through the foreign service from Moscow to New York. Picked up racing again once I arrived in the United States, which was in '85, and started building bikes again. And build bikes as a hobby for myself and for friends until 14 years ago. 14 years ago, I received the transfer back to Europe. The United States is my home in the meantime. So my wife and I just made the decision to quit the job with the foreign service, which was, as you can imagine, a jump in the cold water. And I started the company while I was still living in New York. I had a fairly large workspace in Long Island City, which I consequentially lost. And then we moved to New Hampshire, and I rented at the beginning, a fairly small space within an old mill complex, textile mill complex, and expanded over the years. I've got a fairly large space now in the meantime. And luckily, it turned out to be a success.
I was trying to keep up with all the places you're going. I wonder if you can describe for me a little bit what it was like motorcycle wise. What was the motorcycle scene like? Austria versus south of France versus Germany versus Soviet Russia, and then finally the US. Was there big differences or?
Yeah, tremendous differences between how Europeans see motorcycling, see racing, see a two-wheeled form of transportation in the first place compared to the United States. So when I came to America, I was surprised how much attitude is attached to owning and riding motorcycles. Kind of surprised me. And in Europe, it's seen still to this day as a form of transportation, as a smart form of transportation, for one, and then two, it's seen as a sport. And not necessarily as an extension of someone's ego. So I think this is the major difference between not only Europe, I think in general, the rest of the world and the United States. In the United States, bikes are, seen differently.
Is that just an influence of kind of the ramifications from World War II, or is that just a cultural difference that didn't make its way across the pond, as it were?
I think it's just a cultural difference. And I think this is where I think the industry in the United States, motorcycle industry, the brands could change things. Especially nowadays, there's a need. Obviously, the motorcycle industry in the United States has some difficulties, but there are tremendous opportunities. I don't think it's all dark. I think these nowadays are actually good for the motorcycle industry.
I was going to
There
pick
need to be some fundamental changes, but it's definitely good for the industry for sure.
Yeah, I was going to pick your brain on this subject later, but maybe we can do it now. I mean, what do you think we could be doing differently? What do you think the American manufacturers or the American subsidiaries should be changing?
Well, a friend of mine, Alex Boguski, he words it quite well. I mean, he says that that's obvious that the motorcycle brands are selling to motorcycle people only. And I think that fact alone somehow needs to change. There are only 95% of Americans that do not like motorcycles, that do not ride motorcycles. So how do you reach more people and get them interested in motorcycles? Not only motorcycles, but a form of transportation on two wheels in the first place. So there are a lot of questions that need to be asked, and I think the answers are: one, they're too scary. People feel they're not safe. They're too expensive. A lot of people think that modern motorcycles are intimidating, which they certainly are. We can elaborate a little bit on that. There are very few opportunities to make baby steps. When I grew up, I mean, there were mopeds everywhere. It was much, much easier to get to know how to ride a motorcycle, to get into biking. I think Americans don't have that. A lot of Americans, a lot of new generations don't think that motorcycles represent modern thinking. They're not necessarily inspiring, and it's the wrong lifestyle. And I think all these things are actually opportunities for the industry to change things, because there's a renewed interest in a smart form of transportation, and two wheels, be it e-bikes, for example, mopeds, electric bikes, could play a much bigger role and should play a much bigger role.
It's interesting what you said about intimidation and kind of the stepping stones that we need. I mean, that's a design issue. I mean, as a designer, what do you see the opportunities?
Well, it's not only a design issue. I think what brands need to have people on the ground that ask the questions: why is it that a lot of young people are intimidated by the bikes? I mean, the performance levels that those machines are capable of nowadays can only be controlled by smart electronics. And I think what that does is it narrows the opportunities for the industry to sell more bikes. I think what we should all come to grips with is that what we really enjoy about motorcycles is having fun. The joy of being on two wheels. And I think the unfortunate thing is that high-tech applications on bikes somewhat take that joy out of riding motorcycles. You constantly, for me, for example, I have that, if I ride a true performance bike, 220 horsepower motorcycle, I have that in the back of my mind that if anything goes wrong with my electronics, as I push through the corners, I can hurt myself. So I think it would be, if there would be smaller bikes available, if there would be an incentive to push smaller bikes, it would make it easier for young people. One, they can afford it, easier to buy a motorcycle. They can afford it, and they can learn how ride a motorcycle, and they can learn how much fun it is to ride a bike. And so plenty of opportunity.
I'm kind of curious to see when you go around to the different motorcycle shows and interact with fans and motorcyclists, what impression do you get of the younger generations, people my age and below?
Well, first of all, it's kind of dismays me that there are not that many young people at motorcycle shows in the first place. A few months ago, I was in Toronto and at the International Motorcycle Show, and there are not a lot of 18, 19-year-olds. And I think this is where us as custom builders play a bigger role. I think we can guide the bigger industries along by showing them what young people are really interested in. I think we are much more flexible as a small business nowadays than those large corporations. They are obviously much slower. They have a giant infrastructure behind that they need to stick to. So it's much more difficult for them to come up with new, smarter products and react to what the market really needs. And I think this is where us as custom builders could play a bigger role, I think.
How do you interpret those needs? Or is it through talking to younger riders? Is it through talking to people at shows? Or do you kind of go with your gut and trust your instincts and have like your own personal vision that you hope others will follow?
Well, not only that. I mean, when you talk to young people, the majority of young people are not really interested in high performance motorcycles. Very few people are interested in true superbikes. They're interested in riding cool bikes. They're interested in having fun. And I think that's what needs to happen is to build machines that allow that to be cool and to have fun. And 600-700 pound machines, be it adventure bikes, be it bikes that you can use for long-term travels. Look, they're not fun. And companies like KTM, for example, prove a point. I mean, their small CC bikes are outselling all their super bikes. And I think by offering affordable small CC bikes, I think we would bring more young people in the fold for sure.
One of the things I find really interesting with all your designs, well, maybe not all of them, but you seem to be quite the Ducati fan. Tell me your relationship with this brand and why you pick their platform so often for your builds.
Well, the visceral experience of riding a Ducati, even contemporary Ducatis, is quite different than riding a different brand. And this is why I stick with Ducatis throughout all these times. It's they're also extremely rewarding to ride. They're until recently they were all twins, at least the majority of the models. So the way they perform on the wrist is quite different than, let's say, a high horsepower four-cylinder bike. So it's you ride the torque curve, and through riding the torque curve, you need to be smooth. In order to be smooth, you need to teach yourself how to focus to get the best out of a two-cylinder. So for a four-cylinder bike, horsepower is always a factor that comes into the 10,000, 12,000 RPM range. and which is then fairly difficult to control. With the twin, it's all about being smooth. It's all about riding the torque curve. It's all about holding momentum. And this is where the fun comes in. This is where the challenge comes in to be consistent. And I'm speaking about the track now, to be consistent with your lap times and so on and so forth. So yeah, twins is what makes it fun for me, for sure.
Tell me what's in your garage. Are you purely an Italian V twin guy, or do you have an array of different flavors in there?
No, I don't own a street bike. I have a Honda dirt bike. I've got a 450 Honda dirt bike. I've got an electric dirt bike. I have a vintage Ossa Trials bike. I'm in the process of building one of my auto-paced path bikes, which would be my first personal street bike in years. And I've got a handful of electric bicycles that I use on a daily basis to go to work and so on and so forth.
It's interesting that you don't really have any street bikes, especially considering all your creations are kind of, I would say, street focused.
Most of them are, yes.
Yeah. It was funny. I was just running over the numbers for this year so far, and obviously street bike sales aren't doing well, but dirt bike sales are doing quite well. Do you feel like you could have your next bike be more dirt focused, have it be a pure dirt bike, or is there a reason you keep making street bikes and track models?
The dirt bikes are very focused machines, and there's a fairly narrow market for it. And concerning e-bikes, for example, I think Alta did extremely well as an e-dirt bike. But for me as a business owner, to focus on recreating a dirt bike, especially since there are so many really, really great machines out there, I think it's futile. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me to recreate, unless a client really pushes me to build a dirt bike, but doesn't make a lot of sense.
Gotcha. Okay. Walk me through your design process. How do you think up of a new model? How do you approach, your kind of creative juices and organize them?
It just really depends what I have. As you know, I've got 5 models available right now. When I developed my first series bike, which is the Leggero, which is based on a Ducati twin, air-cooled twin, I wanted to get the best out of the air-cooled twin motor and celebrate with its design, celebrate all the classic motorcycle design elements, but use modern components such as Öhlins forks, Öhlins shocks, modern brakes, fuel injection systems, electronic harnesses, and so on and so forth, and but stick to recognizable classic design elements. And this was the idea behind the Leggero. With the Superbike, the SBK, for years I wanted to build a true performance bike that is competitive on the racetrack with modern machines that are built by larger brands. So it was really, I guess it was an ego trip for me. Luckily, I found some clients that helped me develop the bikes, but it was a tremendous financial undertaking, it pushed us. It pushed me as the business owner, and pushed us as a team. At that time, I had 2 employees. It was a challenge, and quite successful.
What's a typical day look like for you?
I start fairly early, so I get up usually around 6:30. Make myself a cup of coffee. Our house is situated on top of a hill, so what we have no immediate neighbors. So what I do is I bring my cup of coffee now during the spring months and the fairly long New England summers. Bring my coffee out with me and just kind of reflect on the previous day in the workshop. Make myself some mental notes of what needs to be done during a day. And then briefly read the news. Nowadays, I guess we all sometimes try to avoid them. And then usually by 8:30, 9 o'clock, I begin work in the shop. Lately come home for lunch since all the businesses are closed, so I can't buy my sandwich in the neighborhood store. Have a brief lunch and then usually work until 6:30. And then answer emails, work on some concepts for this year and beginning of next year, and work usually until around 9:30, and then try to read a few pages, and then go to bed. So meaning I wake up with work and I go to bed with work.
Yeah, you're kind of sleeping and doing the whole thing. That's funny that you say that, because I feel, I mean, I definitely see that in my own life. And when I talk to other people that own their own business, and especially if they work from home, there is this blurring of let's say life and work, where you're always kind of working. So my struggle has always been how to manage burnout. And I'm curious how you stay interested, how you find inspiration, how you find new ideas, because sometimes it's easy to kind of get stuck in your own little corner and not see what else is going on.
Well, I guess I fight myself on a daily basis. What I mean with that is I fight myself to do my utmost best in my workshop and as a designer, if you will. And I guess that fight alone keeps me energized. Inspiration sometimes gets somewhat difficult because you keep your peripheral as close as possible, keep your horizon as far out as possible to see of what's out there. You need to be need to be in tune of what not only the industry is doing, but also about the world we live in. And I sometimes catch myself missing out on other things in life, meaning enjoy a sunny day, enjoy a walk, kind of leave work behind. That's sometimes is sometimes difficult. My wife sometimes talks to me, and I catch myself just nodding, and boy, it sometimes doesn't sink in. and she reminds me that my head seems to be somewhere else all the time, which is work. But
I think it takes a brave man to admit that on a live YouTube chat. I want to take a second. We had a good question on the site from Rusty Shackelford, but I also want to give kind of a prompt to our our viewers right now to get their questions in. But he was asking, what's the biggest challenge that you face when you're designing a new motorcycle? And is it going through the different iterations of the designs for a final product, or is it coming up with new tooling to be consistent, to create subsequent models? What's the biggest hurdle there?
Well, the biggest hurdle really is for me, it doesn't necessarily make sense to just build one-offs. The biggest challenge for me is to develop parts and develop bikes that are as focused as possible. What I mean with that is to come up with components that have multiple functions. And what that allows me to do is to build fewer parts, make a lighter bike, fewer parts, make a better performing bike. So those are big challenges. And through answering all these mechanical design challenges, I usually then find answers for all the drapings. What I mean with drapings is how a subframe, for example, is shaped, or how the knee cutout needs to be, where the foot pegs are located, and so on and so forth. So I think at the end, those answers for technical solutions, those questions for technical solutions are then being answered by the design really needs to follow the function.
How do you manage that marriage of design and the technical side of it? Because that's, especially with someone like yourself that makes such performance focused motorcycles, if you're going to go take a bike on the track, it needs to go do the thing. It needs to be right. It needs to have the correct geometry. The suspension needs to actually work, and all these things. So how do you balance that out?
Well, I guess I'm lucky. I started riding performance bikes early on, and so I have a very good understanding of, and I've been on the racetrack. Gosh, many years. I haven't raced in 5 years now, but I paid my dues on the racetrack, and so I've got a very good understanding how geometries work, how suspensions work. So I have a very good idea of how bike needs to be set up, how frames need to be set up, and I'm lucky enough to have people in my life that taught me how to build those things, how to work with metal, how to work with machines. I was lucky enough to have people in my life that worked with me with new technology concerning SolidWorks and so on and so forth. Aaron Johnson, my former employee, he was a whiz with SolidWorks. So I was able to introduce all the latest technology and then come up with bikes that hopefully not only look good, but also do the job and build machines that are as focused as possible.
Rusty had a follow-up question. He just wanted to know what is the most enjoyable part of the build process for you? Is it the conceptualizing? Is it building it itself? Is it seeing the finished product roll out of your workshop?
The discovery that the concept makes sense once I work myself through the process of conceptualizing the bike, and I finally come to an answer. If it works or not, I discovered that it all makes sense. All the everything falls into place. That's the most rewarding process, because that's really where the battle is fought, is to come up with something that makes sense and works. Not only looks good, but works. And that's for me the most rewarding process. And then the actual building process. But in most cases, I've got the bikes already finished in my head before I start the actual process of building them. And while I go through the building process of one bike, my head is already on the next project or on the next concept. I keep constantly challenging myself with how to move forward.
I see Josh Marsh was asking in the comment section if you've ever been approached by an OEM to help them with other design or idea creation. And
yes, yeah, there were companies several companies that approached me to redesign some of their bikes, use their bikes as a platform. The problem is when you run a small business, this needs to be a certain amount of income, and so that's one aspect why I've never went ahead and just worked with a larger brand. And it's also that I'm lucky enough to be really busy. Most brands need their bikes done within a few months. So I simply can't toss my clients out and start working for a larger brand for a fairly short period of time. So that's why until recently had to turn it down. But it doesn't mean that I don't want to. It's just I simply wouldn't make sense for me. I can't push a client out of their way in order to help a brand out. So that's the main reason.
It's interesting to see that you're kind of in this interesting nexus where you see some custom builders, they do just one-offs. And then on the other side of that spectrum is an OEM, and they're obviously serializing their production. And you're in the middle where you're making custom bikes, but they're also part of a series. So you kind of have the benefits of both those parties, but you also have both the detriments, because it's very hard to make a bike that's ready for production that you can make multiple copies over multiple iterations. I mean, is that, you're a business person, so like obviously that's intentional, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So I do build, I usually build one custom bike a year. These bikes usually go to special clients of mine. And I use the design process to just keep learning, come up with new ideas for projects that I can then put into small production. And it makes so much more sense to continue on an idea, finish a concept by building more than just one, because by the time you arrive on the third or fourth bike, you end up with a significantly better machine. You learn through the building process of how you could do it better the next time around. And so this is really what I'm interested in, is build the best possible machines that I can push out the door, and designing bikes in order to build them as a series really does make sense.
Switching gears a little bit, I'm curious to hear about your experience and your process with the pack design and using the electric platform from Alta, and how that came about. Let's start with that. How about that?
Yes. Yeah, it was a fun project. I did that with together with Mike Mayberry, creator of Ronin Motorcycles. I think, a great brand of a true American motorcycle company. And so Mike and I are friends for years now, and we did chat for years, just about the state of the motorcycle industry and smart forms of two-wheel transportation and so on and so forth, and our interests in small bikes. Since most electric bikes are small motorcycles, we finally, and I was interested for many years in electric motorcycles just because they represent progress. They represent a true alternative to gasoline-powered bikes. We both were wondering what's out there that him and I would possibly be interested in owning. And so we both went on a search and went through the different brands, and none of us could really come up with anything that we would really want to own. And this realization was then the stepping stone to just come up with our own brand or own interpretation of an e-bike. So a lot of, as you probably understand, a lot of resources need to be made available when you develop a bike from scratch, meaning develop a new battery pack, new software programs, and so on and so forth. So we started with the Alta Redshift as a base model because they were, one, truly successful racing their bike against gasoline-powered bikes, and their machines are of truly high quality. At the end, we didn't really use that many Alta parts. We ended up then just using their battery pack and their transmission and some of their wiring harness, but then build a completely new bike around it. That again is quite a focused machine. It really is an urban enduro, I would like to call it. It's very light, it's very nimble, and I think it's something that Alta was not able to build. I think they had some intentions of building a true street bike, but unfortunately had to give up before they were able to finish their street bike concept. So this is how the pact came to be. And so I'm in the process of actually completing 3 bikes right now as we speak for 3 clients. And I can tell you they're a tremendous amount of fun. Yeah.
I'm always kind of curious about the design that seems to come out of the electric side of the industry, because I'm trying to think of a polite way to say that, maybe pushing the boundaries of what a motorcycle should look like seems to come from that side. But it ties in well with the question from Giovanni in the chat, because he was asking, what are the difference between building a quote unquote classic motorcycle versus something that's electric? Is there special design considerations that have to come into play? Is the technical aspect enough of a hurdle that you have to do something different, or is it a motorcycle is a motorcycle?
I think at the end, you're right. Motorcycle is a motorcycle. I think e-bike technology invited designers to approach motorcycle design in a very different way than one would think. A lot of designers think that there's a tremendous amount of freedom in coming up with new ideas how these things need to perform and need to look. But I think at the end, at least my opinion is that there's certain aspects that you need to hold on to in order to ride them safely and have fun. So your hands need to land in a certain place. Your crotch need to be in a certain place in relationship to where your foot pegs are, where your arms are. Geometries need to function within a certain perimeter in order to make it safe and make it fun. And then the challenge is to build something, especially with e-bikes, that is as clean as possible from the design aspect, and allows the client to discover how much fun an e-bike can really be. These are the challenges.
I remember I had a conversation with Michael Siz once about the shape of the fuel tank, and talking about electrics, how we have this notion of you have to have a fuel tank and it has to be shaped a certain way. And this was right around the time too when fuel tanks weren't really fuel tanks anymore; they were more airbox covers. But the genesis of that conversation was just this idea of like we could start rethinking certain shapes and certain conceptions that we have of what makes a motorcycle when they start becoming electric. And I'm kind of curious to see what your thoughts are on that.
Well, it's all true that designers trying to put a fuel tank on an e-bike, but there needs to be something there for your knees to rest on. You need to just steering through the corners. You just simply need a place for your thighs and for your knees to land to. In most cases, designers or builders then end up putting a fake fuel tank, if you will, on the frame in order to cover that aspect. But it doesn't have to be a fuel tank. It doesn't have to be shaped as a fuel tank. I think the shape of the front frame, if you will, of the pack is kind of a good example. It doesn't necessarily look like a tank, but it still functions as a place so you can rest your knees against when you steer the bike through the corners.
Let's look bigger picture. Where do you see the motorcycle industry headed? And maybe let's just focus that on the U.S. because there's maybe a difference between the U.S. and Europe and Asia.
There's a big difference between Europe and Asia, but I think again I think there's a great opportunity. It's a good time for the motorcycle industry, and a lot of people don't agree with me. They think it's motorcycle industry in the United States is at its end, but I think there are tremendous opportunities. There is a renewed interest in smaller bikes. There is a new interest in e-bikes. This is, I think, where e-bicycles are being sold out everywhere in the United States, and I think this is where the brands should see this as an example that the public is ready to embrace two wheels, and then come up with a product that answers that renewed interest. And I think it's easier than one would think. It's just if they focus less on trying to sell performance bikes and focus more on what people are really interested in, especially nowadays during COVID-19, people are rethinking mass transportation and so on and so forth. They rather get on their e-bikes, and the e-bicycles could easily become a segue into buying motorcycles.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great time.
Yeah.
Great opportunities.
No, I agree with you, especially when you look at the sales figures for electric bicycles, and it looks like a hockey stick on a graph. And I look at kind of, I mean, there's some interesting products kind of coming from a bunch of different places, but the one that stands out in my mind is Cake from Sweden, where you kind of have this crossover between, is it a dirt bike, is it a mountain bike, is it something in between, and that just looks like a gateway drug to getting someone on a motorcycle, and it's just like two-wheel crack.
Yeah, it's a fantastic product. It's fantastic for so many different reasons. I think what Cake achieved is Cake designed a bike that allowed people to realize, people that weren't interested in motorcycles in the first place, suddenly liking motorcycles. And I think there are many answers for that, but I think one of them is that, first of all, the thing doesn't look intimidating. It's so, and I think that's a great thing. It's designed in such a way that the bike is easily, consumers understand what each component does. The bike is understood for what it's built for. That's another aspect. Color choices. It's a win-win situation for sure.
Just looking at some of the questions I've neglected in the chat. Nicholas Harrison is asking who your favorite client has been.
One of the great things about being a custom builder is that you need to get to know your clients in order to give them the bike that they're lusting after. And I think these are one of the great rewards. So over the years, I got to know a lot of really interesting people, and became close friends with a big majority of my clients. So I don't have one client that I like over another, but Nicholas Harrison, for example, is one of my closest friends. I can say that. Yeah.
That was excellently navigated there. Very diplomatic. Going back to this idea, I didn't realize that you just did a one-off custom each year. I mean, we don't usually see those surfacing, the best of my knowledge. So
I don't push them because they're not necessarily represent what my company stands for. So that's why I don't push them. But I enjoy the design process and the building process for sure.
Do those find inspiration in the bikes that are in your lineup now, or are they truly separate from what you're doing? Like if Jensen Beeler shows up with a bunch of money and says, Walt, build me a Kawasaki Ninja, your version of a Kawasaki Ninja, is that in the wheelhouse?
Then I would turn it down, yes. But it just really depends what the client is interested in.
Okay.
I just started the build process for another e-bike for the Haas Museum in Dallas, Texas, which is just an awesome place. Any of you motorcycle guys out there, if you ever find yourself in Dallas, I mean, you got to see the museum. It's fantastic. So Bobby Haas has already one of my customs, and he commissioned another one, which is an e-bike. It's a great joy for me to build one of. But again, it's really something that I can only do one a year.
we're getting towards the time here for our chat. So I just want to give a last call warning for questions from the chat room. But DJ Volstad wants to know if you give tours at your workshop or if you would be open to it once the COVID restrictions are eased up. Or
yeah, absolutely, anytime. Just please make sure, give me either a shout, call me in my workshop, or send me an email, and make arrangements ahead of time. And I'm happy to give you guys a tour. Absolutely.
Wow. Tell me about the designs that never come to the light of day. Is there anything that kind of, filmmakers always talk about the cuts they make on the filming floor, and is there any thoughts that you've had or designs that you've had, or even maybe builds that you're just that one's just for you?
Yeah, especially now with the emergence of the e-bike technology, there are some design concepts, some sketches that I really did sweat over, and then ended up just having to toss them out. It's a great challenge to build an e-bike that is still a true motorcycle, and so I had to give up a handful of concepts. I'm working on something at the moment that makes sense for me, so we'll see. I'll keep you posted over the next few months for sure.
All right, as long as you don't give that exclusive to Chris Hunter. That guy, he's got enough of them already.
Yeah.
Tell me about the bellwethers you use when you think about the motorcycle industry. Do you look at what's going on in the car space? Do you look at fashion? Do you look at music? What are your kind of markers?
Markers for the motorcycle industry. I'm interested in any visual stimulant. Sometimes a pair of shoelaces, if you will, I can use as a stimulant to come up with some graphics for my bikes. Gallery visits. Sitting in my yard sometimes helps me focus and find answers. I sometimes struggle for a day or two and have a block, and then wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then within half an hour have a concept on paper that really makes sense. So, and that comes from making sure that I walk the earth with open eyes. What I mean with that is just keep me as informed as possible, not only about where the industries are, but in general where we are as humans, and I think it's all interwoven. And I think the more I guess all of us inform us, I think the better we are off. So
Well, I don't see any more questions from the chat, and I've run out of my own. So I think we'll just end it right here on the mark for the hour.
Great.
But I want to thank you for taking time to talk to me and to talk to everyone that's been watching, and we'll watch the show once it goes up on YouTube for delayed consumption, we'll call it.
Right. Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's great to talk to you. And I'm very curious to see what comes out of your workshop next. Like I said before, I think you're right at the tip of the spear when it comes to making great looking motorcycles, and more importantly, great looking motorcycles that can actually go be ridden and taken on the track. And obviously, as a sport bike guy, that's a very important thing for me as well.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Ciao.